Lord Peter Wimsey stood on the uneven gravel path outside the modest vicarage at St. Mirrowolds, a village so unremarkable that the local postmark bore the tagline, "An aside on the road to somewhere better." The late spring sun, valiantly trying to pierce the gathering grey clouds, flickered through a delicate lace of hawthorn blossoms, lending the scene a peculiarly sentimental aspect that Wimsey found mildly displeasing. Sentiment, he thought, was the refuge of the inarticulate and the guilty. He was here on the invitation of the Reverend Harold Penrose, an acquaintance more through ecclesiastical happenstance than genuine affection, summoned by a peculiar request that struck Wimsey's curiosity as equal parts trivial and tantalizing. The vicarage itself was an exercise in English understatement, a modest two-story affair, pale cream walls slashed with black timber, and a garden that looked as though a committee of well-meaning but ill-coordinated parishioners had taken turns at its design, each working from a different horticultural manual. Wimsey's attention was drawn, almost involuntarily, to a particular window on the ground floor. The west-facing sitting-room window, as he was soon informed. It was a large, sash window with small panes of glass, so old they caught the light at odd angles, scattering it like a prism, and transforming the drab interior into a kaleidoscope of muted colours. "Quite charming, isn't it?" said the vicar's wife, who had appeared behind him with a tray of tea and a look of guarded hospitality. "Though the window faces the wrong garden, if you ask me. The roses are much better on the north side." "Ah," said Wimsey, taking a measured sip, "but the roses on the north side face the ancient yew, which, while picturesque, lacks the necessary symmetry. You see, Mrs. Penrose, windows are not merely apertures to the world, but arguments in glass and wood. One's choice of garden to face is quite the rhetorical question." Mrs. Penrose blinked politely, evidently unsure whether to regard this as profound or impertinent. Before the vicar could interject, the butler, a sombre man, with a face like carved granite and hands that seemed too large for domestic delicacies, approached, carrying a letter. His gait was slow and measured, as though every step was an argument with time itself. "Lord Peter Wimsey," said the butler, laying the letter on a side table. "This arrived this morning, addressed to you. No indication of sender." Wimsey raised an eyebrow and broke the seal. The letter was typed, unusually terse for the era, and read, "A window that looks the wrong way may hide more than mere roses. Come at midnight to the old garden shed behind the vicarage. You will find what you seek." Wimsey set the letter down with the faintest twitch of a smile. "A most theatrical summons, Reverend. I do hope the midnight hour is not a mere affectation." "None of us knows what to make of it," said the vicar gravely. "The garden shed was locked up for years and abandoned since the last vicar's death." "Curious," murmured Wimsey. "Indeed. The wrong garden, locked sheds, mysterious letters. It all smells faintly of something someone wishes to keep buried, either in soil or in silence." He glanced back toward the west window, the afternoon sun now sinking behind the clouds. The glass reflected a distorted image of the garden, fragmented and unclear, much like the puzzle he had just been invited to unravel. The game was afoot, and Lord Peter Wimsey was already in full stride. Wimsey, never one to refuse an invitation so clearly wrapped in melodrama, elected to forego the conventional dinner hour in favor of an early evening stroll around the vicarage grounds. he informed the Reverend Penrose with a glint of mock solemnity that digestion was best served by curiosity. The vicar, who had a fondness for tepid milk puddings and biblical metaphors, murmured something about wandering in the garden in the cool of the day, and retreated into the study, where theological commentaries might distract him from whatever lurking embarrassment the peculiar letter might portend. The garden itself was a study in neglected ambition. To the west lay the so-called wrong garden, a small rectangular space bordered by hawthorn and hydrangea, dominated by a narrow flagstone path leading nowhere in particular. It was here the aforementioned sash window gazed out with a kind of blank impertinence. A pale climbing rose had begun to thread its way up one of the timber posts nearby, scenting the air with a sweet perfume that Whimsy found both pleasant and disconcerting. Too heavy, too deliberate, like an actress's overdone perfume in an otherwise plain drawing-room. To the east, a more cheerful prospect emerged, the larger garden, open to the morning sun, where gooseberry bushes huddled like whispering conspirators, and an uneven trellis leaned wearily under the weight of a sagging clematis. But it was to the back of the property that Whimsy now turned his attention, past a stretch of lawn riddled with molehills, and onto a patch of uneven ground where the grass grew higher and the hedges were left to their own devices. There stood the shed. It had the appearance of something accidentally forgotten by time, a low, slanted structure with peeling green paint and a rusted iron latch that caught the light like an accusing finger. The window, if it could be so generously called, was a small pane of glass covered with chicken wire and so thick with grime that Whimsy saw only his own reflection, warped and ghost-like. He tried the latch, locked, as expected. Still, he noted that the earth at the threshold showed the faintest signs of disturbance, an impression not of heavy traffic, but of recent presence. Grass bent unnaturally at the root. Someone had been here, and not long ago. Whimsy withdrew a small notebook from his coat pocket and made a brief notation, an idle habit that sometimes served more to focus the mind than to preserve it. He stood still for another minute, listening, not for anything in particular, but for what might be missing. The wind stirred the leaves listlessly. Somewhere far off, a rook called once, then fell silent. No one else appeared to be in the garden. That night, the house was curiously subdued. Dinner passed with a kind of distracted civility, the vicar attempting conversation about early English hymnals, while Mrs. Penrose stabbed listlessly at a shepherd's pie. Whimsy, all airy charm and carefully measured absent-mindedness, inquired whether the house had ever experienced any minor hauntings, polite ones, nothing dramatic. This elicited a soft laugh from Mrs. Penrose and a disapproving throat clear from the vicar, who had evidently spent too long avoiding his parishioners' flirtations with the supernatural to find it amusing. As the hour approached midnight, Whimsy excused himself from the drawing-room and stepped outside. The air was damp and cool, smelling of earth and moss, and the heavy sweetness of the climbing rose. He moved soundlessly, a long shadow among others, and made his way to the shed. The door opened easily this time. No click of latch, no squeal of hinges. It simply drifted ajar, as though awaiting his touch. Inside, the smell was overpowering. Old wood, mildew, and something else, acrid and metallic. He stepped forward, ducking his head slightly. A single oil lamp flickered from a bracket on the wall. Someone had lit it, recently, He could still smell the faint sting of burnt match. The shed was small, barely 10 feet square, its floor littered with the detritus of old gardening life, spades, rotting twine, a watering can with a hole in the side. But what caught Whimsy's eye was not any of this. It was the chair. At the center of the room, incongruously placed, stood an ordinary wooden chair of the type found in schoolrooms and servants' quarters. It was angled not toward the lamp, nor toward the door, but toward the window, and on its seat lay a woman's glove, left hand only, ivory kid leather, of fine but unremarkable quality. One button fastened, one broken. Whimsy approached it carefully, not touching at first. The glove was clean, dry, too clean. No dust had settled on it, no sign it had been there long. He reached out, finally, and picked it up with 2 fingers. No label, but the lining was faintly scented. Not perfume, soap, lavender, most likely. He straightened, just as a sound interrupted the hush. A faint creak behind him. He turned at once, but the doorway remained empty. The garden beyond was darker now, the moon shrouded behind a sheet of cloud. He stepped outside and listened again. Nothing. He made one slow circle of the shed, scanning the grass, the hedges, the stone wall in the distance. No movement. Still, that someone had entered the shed, left a glove, lit the lamp, and then vanished, was no longer mere speculation. It was an assertion. Back in the vicarage, the household had gone to bed. He returned to his room quietly, setting the glove on the small writing desk beside his bed. Before extinguishing the lamp, he considered the chair's position one final time in his mind. A single chair facing a window that, from the shed's angle, would show little but the back hedge, and, if one leaned just so, the west-facing wall of the vicarage, specifically the sitting-room window, the one facing the wrong garden. Whimsy made another notation in his book. Why sit and watch an empty window? Unless, not empty? Glove suggests presence, not absence. Someone waited, not for what they would see, but for what might be seen from within. He closed the book with a snap and extinguished the light. Morning came with a burst of bird song and a rather sharper knock on the door than propriety typically demanded. Whimsy rose, pulled on his robe, and opened it to find the vicar's butler, Pritchard, looking even more granite-faced than usual. "I beg your lordship's pardon," the man said, voice as dry as toast left in a warming drawer. "But there's been an incident." "What sort?" asked Whimsy, already reaching for his clothes. Pritchard hesitated. "It's Miss Carter, found this morning in the west garden, the one you remarked upon yesterday." "Miss Carter," Whimsy repeated, buttoning his collar. "The organist's niece." "House guest of the Penroses," said Pritchard, lips tight. "Staying here the past fortnight. A very bright young woman, the vicar said. Dead, my lord." "Indeed," said Whimsy mildly. "I suppose she also faced the wrong garden." "She was found seated on the stone bench beneath the window, quite peaceful by appearances. But her neck, well—" Pritchard glanced away for a moment, twisted in a manner inconsistent with peaceful intentions. Whimsy fastened his cufflinks with exaggerated care. "Then I imagine the house is quite unsettled, and the police. Summoned, Inspector Waring is on his way from Cranley." "Splendid," murmured Whimsy. "I shall make tea. I always find that corpses are improved by a pot of lapsang and the correct Latin epigraph." He crossed to the desk, picked up the glove, and turned it over once more in his hand. Then he opened his notebook and underlined the final entry from the night before. The wrong window, the chair, the glove. And now, a body that faced the wrong direction. Whimsy smiled faintly, though it did not reach his eyes. "Curious," he said softly. "Very curious indeed." Inspector Waring arrived with the brisk authority of a man determined to restore order to the absurd. His motor car spluttered to a halt on the gravel, the constable at his heels already unfurling a length of white cordon that struck Whimsy as rather theatrical among the prim rose-beds. The inspector tipped his hat to the vicarage, windows, half salute, half warning, before fixing Whimsy with a look that suggested genial tolerance. They bent together over the stone bench where Miss Carter's slim figure still rested beneath a respectfully placed blanket. Waring's medical man, Dr. Hardinge, murmured in Latin about cervical dislocation. Instantaneous, no struggling, while Whimsy observed the faint impression of kid leather on the victim's right palm. One glove only, as expected. What puzzled him more was the delicate smear of greenish-grey pollen upon the sleeve, hawthorn, if he was any judge, and not in bloom within 20 yards of that bench. Pritchard, summoned again from the house, delivered his statement with the mechanical precision of a tolling clock. He had woken shortly after 5 to set the range, glanced through the scullery window, and noticed the peculiar stillness of the figure outdoors. The butler's distaste for melodrama compelled him to finish his morning duties before raising the alarm. Only when the kitchen maid shrieked at the sight of the motionless guest did he reluctantly present the fact to the household. "You'll observe," Whimsy said mildly to Waring, "that a man who delays reporting a body long enough to polish the silver is either stupendously innocent or dangerously confident. We must ascertain which." Pritchard stiffened at the implication, but volunteered nothing further beyond the assertion that every door and window had been locked at midnight. "Except, my lord, the west parlour sash, which the vicar insists remain ajar for fresh air, despite my objections regarding security." It was a curious detail. Whimsy stored it carefully. Alice, the kitchen maid, proved a more erratic witness. Face blotched red from shock, she insisted she had heard the church clock strike 3 times in rapid succession at 4:30. "Like it was in a hurry, sir," before being silenced by Pritchard's warning stare. Whimsy coaxed her gently, first with a cup of sugared tea, then with a conspiratorial whisper about constables who could not tell a gooseberry from a greengage. She admitted she had peeped through the pantry blind upon hearing a soft tapping outside, like a spoon rattling on china, but saw nothing. The tapping ceased after a minute. When she lifted the blind again, the garden appeared perfectly ordinary, though she thought the window of the shed showed a faint glow, as if someone was reading by lantern. The church clock, Whimsy noted, was an unreliable timekeeper, often a good 10 minutes slow, yet every villager set their lives by its lag. Such consensual inaccuracy was fertile ground for mischief. Inside the drawing-room, Inspector Waring undertook the formalities, while Whimsy drifted about with apparently frivolous attention to furnishings. He straightened a curtain cord here, adjusted a footstool there, and lightly tested the brass catch of the west-facing window. It slid open and shut, without protest, well-oiled, no squeal to betray nocturnal trespass. On the carpet near the sill lay a single pinhead of candle wax. He prized it up with his fingernail, pale beeswax, faintly scented of lavender to match the glove. A candle in the garden shed, a glove upon a chair, and now wax on the drawing-room floor, 3 whispers of the same silent hand. Reverend Penrose, summoned from the study, looked haggard beneath his clerical collar. He spoke warmly of Miss Eleanor Carter, a promising soprano, guest of her elderly uncle the organist, rehearsing Easter anthems in the parish church. She favoured moonlit walks for the quieting of the nerves, so the household thought little of her absence from supper the previous night. Had she enemies? Wimsey asked. None, the vicar insisted, though she possessed, he conceded, a certain independence of mind. Rumour hinted she intended to audition for a London company, abandoning her uncle's modest parish concerts. Such prospects might have vexed local suitor Mr. Felix Garraway, antiquarian bookseller and devoted admirer. At this, Mrs. Penrose, returning from the telephone, cheeks pale, confessed that Garraway had called at 9:30 the previous evening, demanding to speak with Miss Carter, and left in what she termed a most peculiar agitation when informed the young lady was walking in the garden. Detective folklore declared that jealous swains seldom pause to compose cryptic letters, yet Waring seized gratefully on the lead. While the constable cycled off to fetch Garraway, Wimsey ambled into the library, where Miss Carter had practised each dusk. The piano retained the faint resonance of its last chord when he touched the keys, a soft E-flat still trembling in the soundboard. On the music rack lay an anthem marked in her clear hand. A metronome, wound and ticking, registered 88 beats per minute and, curiously, stood aligned not toward the pianist, but toward the window, as though set for an audience outside. Wimsey leaned closer. The triangular rod cast a minute shadow on the polished oak, barely visible save under a certain angle, the identical angle from which one might watch unseen through the shed window if a lamp burned within. He knelt, tracing the parquet with a slim torch until the beam caught a thread of cotton snagged in a floorboard crack. Pale grey, like a wisp of mist, he sealed it in an envelope. Rising, he tapped the metronome gently, then listened. Down the corridor, a clock echoed the tempo, one of those modern electric contraptions that Penrose, enamoured of progress, had installed above the scullery door. Its tick, amplified by tiled walls, marched in lockstep with the metronome. A clever mind could calculate from the kitchen the precise passage being practised without entering the room, provided the pianist worked to that steady pulse. Knowledge of when a piece ended might be the signal to strike or to withdraw. Garraway arrived, red-eyed, broad-shouldered, and smelling faintly of printer's ink. He admitted his call. Miss Carter had promised him an answer, yes or no, to a proposal of marriage. She had seemed torn between affection and ambition. He feared London would change her. On discovering she had taken a walk, his temper flared. He had, he confessed, stomped round the back of the house, hoping to intercept her. But finding the garden empty and the shed door fastened, he abandoned the notion and walked the mile back to his shop, cooling his fury among folios of Donne and Crashaw. Waring pressed him on times. Garraway offered approximate minutes referenced to the Cranley omnibus passing his window at 10:25. Wimsey, with a polite cough, pointed out the omnibus had begun its summer timetable only that morning, and did not run the previous night. Garraway blanched, recalculated, and stumbled. The police smelled triumph, yet Wimsey watched with the air of a don, observing a freshman's first howler. Interesting, but not decisive. After luncheon, the sky darkened, pelting the windows with sudden rain. Whimsy borrowed a mackintosh and ventured out once more to the shed. Inspector Waring, exasperated but courteous, trailed after him. Together they examined the muddy patch before the threshold. Two sets of impressions showed clearly now. One the pointed heel of Miss Carter's Edwardian walking shoes, the other a broader sole with a curious diagonal gouge, perhaps a gardener's boot corrected with a mended plate. Pritchard denied ownership, and produced his polished pumps as evidence. The gardener, old Josiah Bletchley, was laid up with gout, yet someone had borrowed those boots, or something like them, to stand watch in the night. Within, Whimsy replaced the chair exactly where he had found it, sat, and aligned his gaze through the grimy pane. The west window of the vicarage framed itself neatly, its reflections merciful under the grey sky. He raised his pocket glass and discovered, scarcely visible, a tiny distortion in the middle lower pane, a bubble in the antique glass that stretched shapes beyond it into slender shadows. Positioned thus, a watcher could see who sat at the piano, yet from the room inside no eye would detect the observer. "A convenient opera box," Whimsy remarked, "but the wrong way round. The performance unaware of its audience." Returning to the house, he requested, with apologetic humour, permission to search Miss Carter's luggage. Mrs. Penrose assented, weeping softly over the decency of the request. In the guest room, wardrobe hung a single grey travelling cloak. In its pocket lay the missing right-hand glove, fingers damp with yesterday's dew. On the dressing-table he found a folded timetable of Southern Railway, a pencilled ring around the 7:13 to Victoria, and a cheque for £50 drawn on Garraway's account, endorsed but not banked. The arithmetic of love and money seldom balanced, yet this suggested negotiation rather than refusal. At dusk, as rain thinned to mist, Whimsy joined Waring beside the hearth. The inspector, wrestling with contradictory statements, confessed irritation. "What are you after, my lord? Spiritualism or botany? Candle wax, cotton threads, bits of pollen. I want a motive." Whimsy smiled, tossing a sprig of hawthorn he had plucked from the shed roof onto the fire. It hissed and smoked, filling the room with that faint, sweet bitterness. "Patience, Inspector. We share one certainty. Miss Carter's died facing the window she ought never to have faced, at an hour she ought never to have been abroad. The friend who lured her there knew both her habits and the vicarage eccentricities, particularly its clocks. Let us find who in this polite household keeps a time to their own secret pulse. The rest will follow." He excused himself, pleading correspondence, but instead slipped quietly into the parish church. The nave lay dusky, damp stone, exhaling centuries. On the organ bench rested Miss Carter's score. Beside it a small, unremarkable hand mirror leaned against the music stand. Whimsy lifted it. A smudge of beeswax clouded one corner. Holding the mirror before the pipes, he caught a reflection. No, a refraction of the west window of the vicarage across the churchyard, faintly luminous against the gathering dark. He smiled, replaced the mirror, and let the church swallow his footsteps as he departed. The clocks of St. Merewald's chimed 8, but Whimsy, listening, counted only 7 strokes. A minute later, an 8th bell tolled alone, oddly delayed, as though compelled to remark upon its own lateness. "Inconsistent," he whispered into the rain, "and inconsistency is the mother of revelation." He turned toward the vicarage, mind already arranging chairs, gloves, clocks, and human vanities into a pattern visible, for the moment, to him alone. The following morning dawned sharp and bright, all hints of rain, burned off by a sun that threw long, accusing shadows over the vicarage garden. Lord Peter Wimsey, freshly shaved and starched, stood by the sundial just past 6, peering down with mild curiosity at a cluster of petals scattered near the base. Not rose, not camellia, no cultivated flower at all, in fact, but crushed blossoms of wild honeysuckle, limp and trodden underfoot. The vine itself grew wild along the hedge, backing the churchyard wall, a good 30 paces from the path Miss Carter was said to frequent. He stooped and retrieved a broken twig, fragrant and sticky. A lover's token? Perhaps. But who in this tidy little parish would walk a moonlit path through nettles and thorns to gather a sprig of wild honeysuckle? Over a modest breakfast, Wimsey directed an apparently idle inquiry to the vicar. Had Miss Carter been known to use cosmetics or perfume of any particular brand? Reverend Penrose, visibly uncomfortable, deferred to his wife, who confirmed the young woman's toilette was simple and entirely appropriate to a clergyman's niece, a remark Wimsey accepted with a faint smile. He thanked her and excused himself to re-examine the grey travelling cloak. It still held that faint scent, sweet but sharp, not lavender, not beeswax, but honeysuckle. The vicarage garden boasted none. A paradox, then, the scent of something present in the garment, absent from the scene. By mid-morning, the police had completed their initial canvass. Garraway's alibi, once doubted, now sat in a state of suspended disbelief. A tram conductor confirmed that the bookseller boarded the 10:45 from Cranley to return to his shop, arriving damp and irritable, and proceeding to shout at his assistant for misfiling a folio edition of the Fairy Queen. The outburst had been overheard by 2 customers, one of whom recited a relevant stanza, in the hopes of calming the proprietor. Such literary fury might be irrational, but it was demonstrably public. Wimsey, noting the time, made a remark about Spenserian vengeance, and asked Waring whether Bletchley's boots had yet been examined. They had. The soles bore no resemblance to the marks in the mud. The gardener, when asked, had professed his boots had been by his bed all night. As useless to me as Latin to a cat, and no one had disturbed them. "I begin to feel," Waring grumbled, "that this case has a surplus of alibis. People are positively swaddled in them." "Indeed," murmured Wimsey, gazing out the window. "One might say this parish runs like a pocket watch. Shame, really. Nothing so fatal as precision." Shortly after luncheon, the curate arrived uninvited, Reverend Ambrose Ede, a man of uncomfortable enthusiasm and protruding Adam's apple, who confessed that the events had left him spiritually perturbed. Wimsey, sensing nerves rather than piety, encouraged him with half a glass of sherry and the kind of sympathetic silence that draws out schoolboys and distressed organists. Ede eventually admitted that he had observed Miss Carter walking toward the church some time before midnight, but had thought little of it at the time. "She often practiced late, though I confess I was not on my way to any devotions," he added, flushing. "I had gone to fetch the parish record book from the vestry. One of the baptismal entries had a discrepancy, purely clerical." "And you heard nothing unusual?" "A faint tapping," he said, with a quick glance at the window. "As if someone were marking time, or rehearsing, perhaps. I assumed it was Eleanor preparing for Easter services." "Alone?" He hesitated. "Yes, or, at least, I saw no one else. Did you enter the church? No. I only approached the door, then turned back. It did not feel quite appropriate at that hour. And the tapping, did it cease when you turned back? Now you mention it, he said, looking pale. Yes, it stopped quite abruptly. Curious, Whimsy said. That suggests either that you were observed, or that your step upon the gravel was audible within. He let the man leave, then dispatched Bunter with orders to inspect the interior of the vestry, and make notes on its acoustics, particularly the echo against the nave and the garden door. Bunter returned within the hour, bearing a selection of small items, a wax cloth with a faint perfume, a candle stub burned halfway, and a pencil note in faint graphite. See, then D sharp. She favours the discord. The handwriting, though unfamiliar, bore traces of haste and some pressure, written perhaps with the paper balanced upon a hard surface. Dramatic, Whimsy muttered. So our nocturnal theatre had more than one act. He requested the vicar's permission to borrow the key to the church for a private investigation. The vicar, worn and absent, agreed without question. That evening, Whimsy stood again by the organ. The mirror remained as he had found it, and the same faint haze of beeswax clung to the music stand. He propped open the score, reset the metronome, and struck the keys gently. The church responded with a low sigh, sound trembling in the bones of the place. Bunter, waiting outside with his watch, confirmed that the notes could be heard through the open vestry transom, soft but distinct. Enough, Whimsy said, for a clever ear to map the shape of a song and know when to slip through the garden undetected. A light breeze lifted a corner of the rug beneath the organ pedal. Whimsy stooped, lifted it entirely, and found nothing at first. Then, on impulse, pressed along the edge of the floorboard beneath. It yielded with a sharp click. A narrow recess, perhaps once used to stow hymnals or tuning forks, now held something stranger, a small velvet pouch, half filled with gravel. He tipped it into his palm. The grains were of uniform size, each embedded with the same faint scent. He sniffed, recoiled faintly, and smiled. Bunter, he said, do fetch Inspector Waring. I believe we are now ready to revisit the garden. But quietly. Let the household think we are still puzzling over metronomes and ecclesiastical schedules. I should prefer to test a small theory before it becomes common knowledge. Waring arrived, grim but cooperative. In the garden, under the shifting light of the setting sun, Whimsy placed the velvet pouch back on the bench where Eleanor Carter had been found, arranged just so that it might have slipped from her hand, or been placed in it. He sprinkled a trail of the scented gravel from the west window to the path, ending in the honeysuckle vines behind the churchyard wall. Suppose, he said, you were being watched not for your person, but your pattern. Suppose every night you played from a script, and someone watched from the shed, timing your pauses, learning your rhythms. Suppose you decide to break the pattern. No music, no metronome, only a message. To meet, perhaps, or to end an affair. But the observer does not know you've changed the dance. They approach, find not the girl they expect, but her absence. Then, in the dark, confusion, confrontation, and a moment of fatal strength. You believe she was killed here, in the garden? No, I believe she was meant to be seen here, posed, if you like a tableau. But she died in the church. The church? Whimsy tapped his temple. We must think theatrically, Inspector. This was a performance from start to finish. Miss Carter may have intended a final surrender. She had the temperament for it. But someone else stepped on stage uninvited. And now, if I am right, they are already rehearsing their next part. Whom do you suspect? But Whimsy only smiled, watching the trail of gravel glow faintly in the dusk. Let us wait for a change in tempo. And meanwhile, I should like a word with the postmistress. She may remember a telegram sent just after midnight. Something instructive, perhaps. Someone wanted the stage cleared for a private recital. He turned back toward the vicarage, coat billowing like a curtain between acts. The play, it seemed, had not yet reached its climax. But the cost was gathering, and Lord Peter intended to direct the final scene with exquisite timing. The post office at St. Merewold's occupied a single narrow room, tacked on to the back of the village shop, its brass grill polished daily by Mrs. Goddard, who regarded telegrams as inflammable curiosities, best handled with brass tongs and moral disapproval. Whimsy arrived just as she was balancing her morning accounts, and greeted her with a bow extravagant enough to soften her suspicion that he might demand special Sunday opening hours. He produced his card, lamented the disruptive nature of murder upon respectable commerce, and inquired whether any messages had been handed in, or, more tellingly, received, for members of the vicarage household around midnight. Mrs. Goddard's spine straightened to its full moral height. She recalled, with the crystalline precision accorded to gossip, that at 11:20 a village boy had cycled up with a note marked urgent in a plain envelope. The boy, young Thomas Hewer, claimed it was for Miss Carter, to be delivered at once. Mrs. Goddard had protested the lateness. The lad insisted the sender would take it very kind if she rang the vicarage bell rather than wait for regular delivery. Duty battled propriety, and propriety won. Mrs. Goddard promised to dispatch it first thing next morning, which, in village parlance, meant 8:30. "Did you read it, by any chance?" Whimsy asked, all innocence. "Certainly not," she snapped. Then, colouring, confessed she had glimpsed only the first line. "Eleanor, meet me where you can sing without shame." The rest lay folded, sealed by nothing but a dab of wax she recognized as local beeswax scented with honeysuckle, the same compound she used for her church seat polish. Whimsy's eyebrows expressed polite astonishment. Mrs. Goddard added defensively that when she finally delivered the note at 7:30, Mr. Pritchard had taken it upstairs himself, as Miss Carter was already indisposed, a euphemism now rendered painfully ironic. Whimsy left with thanks and a tin of barley sugar for investigative clarity. Outside, Thomas Hewer lounged against his bicycle, throwing stones at a gatepost. He described the letter's sender as "the curate, sir, the tall un with the Adam's apple, said it were important." Thomas had waited in the lane while Mr. Ede scribbled the address and sealed the note, paying the boy with a shilling. The curate had looked flustered, coat thrown over his pyjamas, as though summoned from bed by urgent conscience rather than intrigue. A detail nagged at Whimsy. Why, if Ede feared scandal, did he trust a village imp rather than deliver the missive himself? Unless, of course, he wanted the hour documented, an alibi minted by the postmistress's clock. The curate was discovered in the rectory garden, pruning roses with more zeal than finesse. Confronted, he admitted the note. stammering that he had meant only to guide Eleanor back to the safety of daylight practices. Parish gossip about midnight rehearsals troubled him. The phrase, "sing without shame," was, he insisted, spiritual admonition, not romantic overture. Whimsy listened courteously and asked whether he had entered the shed that night. Ede denied it. Had he borrowed boots from the gardener, whose gout-crippled pair no longer fitted their owner? Again, no, though his eyes flickered toward the vicarage, where Pritchard stood motionless at an upstairs window, granite observation post, unblinking. Whimsy thanked him, advised gentler pruning, and withdrew. Inspector Waring, meanwhile, had traced the diagonal gouged bootprint to a cobbler's repair on a pair belonging to Reverend Penrose himself, boots relegated to cellar storage when he adopted rubber galoshes. Penrose, summoned, appeared genuinely shocked. The boots had not left that cellar for years. Anyone might have fetched them unobserved. Whimsy imagined a figure descending the stone steps, selecting footwear sturdy enough for soft earth, yet unrecognizable in silhouette. A thief who steals only boots means either concealment or disguise. And what disguise, in a vicarage, is more invisible than the vicar himself? That afternoon, Whimsy returned to the church alone. He sat at the organ, leafing through Miss Carter's marked score. Among the marginalia, breathing notes, dynamic markings, he found a newer inscription. C-G-E-D, hold to false cadence. Beneath it, lighter but legible, a second hand had added a cryptic response. Modulate to silence. The ink of the first was violet, Miss Carter's, the second, black, sprawling, and, if his memory of sermons served him, the curate's. So, a dialogue in notation. She proposed daring dissonance. He urged restraint. Musical morality turned literal. Whimsy pressed the C-G-E sequence. The sound rolled cavernously. He let it fade, then struck a lone D-sharp that rattled in the nave like a dropped coin. The resonance lingered, a ghost note measuring time itself. If one were standing outside by the shed, knowing precisely when that D-sharp should fall, one could act in perfect synchrony. Approach unseen, intercept the performer, guide her or force her into the vestry. The window latch there bore fresh scratches. Within the small chamber, a kneeler lay overturned. He knelt, lifting the cushion, and discovered beneath it a silk handkerchief embroidered F.G. Felix Garraway's. The corner was stiff with beeswax, and a smear of dried sap the colour of rusted iron. He bagged it carefully. Waring greeted this new evidence with a scowl. "Garraway again! I'll have him in Tillingsborough jail by nightfall." Whimsy dissuaded him. The handkerchief proved presence, not violence. The beeswax matched the vicarage candles, not the church tapers. Suppose Garraway came in search of Eleanor, found her missing, perhaps followed a glimmer into the vestry, left his kerchief in alarm, but departed still breathing. "Our murderer," Whimsy said, "tidies scenes, not litters them." That evening, a village meeting packed the parish hall. Officially, it concerned the Easter pageant. Unofficially, it buzzed with speculation. Whimsy stood at the back, observing currents of suspicion swirl between pew renters and choir mothers. He noted how Pritchard, silent as a stone, positioned himself beside Mrs. Penrose, glowering at any hint of gossip toward his employers. The curate, pale and perspiring, avoided Garraway, who sat alone, thumb worrying the missing corner of a handkerchief. Halfway through the vicar's exhortation on sacred tableau, a loud crack echoed outside, like a musket, but duller. The hall emptied into dusk, to find smoke curling from the church porch. A makeshift brazier, used earlier for scenery paint, stood overturned, its coals spilling across the flagstones. On the porch door someone had chalked a single symbol, a treble clef bisected by an X. Wearing barked orders, villagers stamped on sparks, while Whimsy stooped to study the chalk, fresh, damp from sea air. He glanced at the gathering crowd, who carried chalk, school children, and curates, but the curates' pockets, when politely requested to display their contents, yielded only a battered prayer book and rose thorns. Waring dismissed him with a threat. Back in the drawing-room, Mrs. Penrose poured sherry with trembling hands. She confessed that in her girlhood she had sung duets with Eleanor's mother, that inviting the niece had been sentimental vanity. The night before the murder, Eleanor had declared an intention to leave at once for London, dissatisfied with parochial constraints. The Penroses had urged caution, the high curate had preached humility, Garraway had argued passionately, and Miss Carter, with a soprano's uncompromising pitch, had announced she would sing her own song or none. Mrs. Penrose burst into tears, fearing her advice had pushed the girl into danger. Whimsy comforted her with a quotation from Euripides, tactfully untranslated. Near midnight, Pritchard sought Whimsy in the library. The butler, stiff as century-old oak, confessed he had lied about the garden sash. It had not been left ajar for air. He himself opened it at Miss Carter's request, so she might feel the night on her voice. He waited in the corridor to close it when she returned. Instead, he heard a harsh whisper, male, not Garraway's, urging haste, followed by a dull impact and silence. Afraid of scandal, he shut the window and said nothing, fearing the vicar's reputation would suffer. "Why now?" Whimsy asked. Pritchard's granite facade cracked, loyalty warred with guilt. "Because, my lord, I believe I know whose voice I heard, and if I protect him further, I shall damn my own soul." Whimsy nodded gravely. "Your conscience outweighs your fear." "Very well. Tomorrow, when the clock strikes 9, gather all concerned in the west parlour. I shall demonstrate who mastered the tempo of this tragedy." Pritchard caught his breath. "And the glove, my lord?" "Merely a prop," said Whimsy. "To distract the eye. Our killer relied on misdirection worthy of the Comédie Française. But remember," and here his voice softened, "even the finest actor betrays himself when the curtain falls." A long silence settled over the vicarage corridors as Pritchard withdrew. Whimsy opened his notebook for the last time that night. He wrote 3 names, drew arrows among them, and underlined a phrase, CGED, modulate to silence. Then he capped his pen, stared at the flickering candle, and whispered the line he had once recited on a Cambridge stage. "When the music ends, the truth steps forward." Outside, St. Merewald's clock chimed a lonely hour, wrong by 8 minutes, as always. Whimsy smiled at the error. The next day, every clock in the parish would be forced to strike in unison. Morning in St. Merewald's arrived with a brittle clarity, the sort that laid truth bare without mercy. The air had turned colder overnight, as if the village had drawn in a collective breath it could no longer hold. At 9 precisely, Pritchard opened the west parlour doors, with the solemnity of a man conducting his own funeral. Inside, Whimsy stood already by the hearth, hands clasped behind his back, eyes on the grandfather clock, which, chastened by Bunter's adjustments, now struck the hour with rare punctuality. They came in silence, summoned not by name, but by inevitability, Reverend Penrose and his wife, her lips pale and tight, Garraway glowering, the faint sheen of defiance on his brow. Ede, near trembling, eyes sunken from a night of broken sleep. And finally, Inspector Waring, arms folded, every inch the skeptic forced to attend a magician's trick. Whimsy motioned for them to sit. Pritchard remained by the door, a quiet sentinel. Bunter, unnoticed in a corner, took notes with discreet efficiency. "The business we are about to conclude," Whimsy began softly, "is not one of conjecture, nor of legal convenience. It is, I trust, the resolution of music interrupted. Miss Carter, whatever else she was, understood rhythm. Her killer did not." There was a stir. Waring shifted. Penrose looked briefly at his wife, and Garraway frowned. Whimsy stepped away from the fire. "Last night a symbol was chalked on the church door, clef and crossbar. That was not mere graffiti. It was a signal, likely intended for someone in this room, a silent postscript to an unfinished movement. But I believe the killer misjudged something crucial. He assumed no one had heard the true cadence of Eleanor Carter's final act." He turned to the curate. "Reverend Ede, you said you wrote to Miss Carter on the night of her death. The note we recovered bore your phrasing, 'Sing without shame.' A touching sentiment. You claimed it was a plea for modesty, yet in her music she had marked those very words beside the most daring progression in the whole score. Your message was not rebuke, it was collusion." Ede's mouth parted. I meant to warn her, to ask her to reconsider her direction. Her ideas were becoming dissonant." "She admired dissonance," Whimsy said evenly. "She sought to challenge the limits of harmony, not simply musical, but moral. I believe she used her music to say what she could not in speech, including, perhaps, an entanglement with someone in this room." Now all eyes turned on Garraway, who rose an inch from his seat. "If you're suggesting—" "I'm suggesting nothing yet. Mr. Garraway, your handkerchief was found in the vestry, stained with sap and beeswax, but you say you never entered the church that night." "I didn't. She'd borrowed it, Eleanor, that afternoon, to wipe down the keyboard. I'd given her a tin of oil for the pedals, some old stage trick. I suppose she left it behind." "And the scent?" "What scent?" "Honeysuckle," Garraway faltered. "She wore it sometimes. But not that evening. The scent came not from her skin, but from something placed beside her. Gravel, soaked in oil, laid out as if marking a trail." At that, Penrose stirred. "Are you implying this was staged?" "Precisely, Vicar. The garden, the pose, even the broken mirror, chosen not in passion, but with theatrical precision. Miss Carter died not among camellias, but in the vestry, where a struggle broke the kneeler and the window latch. Her body was then carried by someone who knew the layout, who could avoid squeaking boards, and who had both access and motive." He let the silence stretch. Only the ticking clock moved. "You see," Whimsy continued, "someone had attempted to rewrite the scene as a kind of morality play. A fallen woman, overcome by emotion or scandal, found conveniently lifeless beneath the vicarage's pious eaves. But this narrative was flawed. Miss Carter didn't follow shame. She defied it. She wasn't the sort to end her life because of whispers. No, her death served someone else's story." He turned, finally, to Mrs. Penrose. "You loved her mother. That much is clear, and I think you saw in Eleanor something both precious and dangerous. When she threatened to leave, to expose what had been quietly boiling under the village's surface. Affection, perhaps, or a secret kept too long. You tried to stop her." Mrs. Penrose stared at him as if she had forgotten how to blink. Her husband half rose. "My wife, surely this is—" "She opened the garden sash," Wimsey said, "gave Eleanor the candles, encouraged the metronome, encouraged her niece to rehearse at night. Perhaps it began in kindness. Music was how Eleanor processed her grief. But when it became clear that her music spoke too plainly, that her lyrics accused, perhaps even threatened to reveal an affair, then something changed. The mirror was her own, brought down from the guest bedroom. The gravel, scented with her beeswax. Your wax, madam. You polish the pews with it. And the boots, borrowed from your husband's collection. He didn't notice them missing, but you did." Mrs. Penrose looked down at her lap, one hand now gripping the other. Her lips moved silently, as if praying. "I believe," Wimsey said gently, "you confronted her in the vestry. You meant only to stop her leaving, perhaps to frighten her into silence. She resisted. There was a blow. You panicked, staged the body. The letter you later claimed she received was never posted. You wrote it yourself and gave it to the postmistress with the curate's name, knowing his earlier note would make the fiction plausible. Then you lit a candle in the vestry, half-burned, beeswax, placed the pouch of gravel in her hand. It was a theatrical composition, as elegant as it was tragic." "No," Mrs. Penrose whispered. "No, I wanted to protect her. From herself, from what people would say." "But Eleanor didn't fear people," Wimsey said. "She feared silence, being unheard. That's why she played so loudly. That's why she modulated, not to compliance, but to defiance." The room was very still. Then Pritchard stepped forward, cleared his throat, and placed something on the table. It was a slip of manuscript paper. On it, scrawled in hasty ink, were 5 notes: C, G, E, D, followed by a pause, then a final shaking stroke beneath the word. "Truth." "I found this," he said, voice rough. "Beneath the rug, beneath the organ bench. I wasn't sure, but it seemed like a message." Mrs. Penrose reached for it, but her husband gently took her hand, pressing it back to her lap. "I did not know," he said quietly. "If I had, God help me, I would have stopped it." Waring gave a low breath. "You'll testify to all this?" "If she'll allow it," Wimsey said. But Mrs. Penrose was weeping silently now, shoulders shaking, not with shame, but with some long-dammed-up sorrow. Her husband did not speak again. That evening, Wimsey stood once more in the church. He placed the slip of music back upon the organ. The metronome stood still, its pendulum unmoved. Bunter joined him. "She was writing her own ending, wasn't she, my lord?" "She was," Wimsey said, "but someone else turned the page." "Will they hang her?" Wimsey sighed. "Perhaps not. The courts have little appetite for widowed rectors, but what remains of her will live here forever, in the music, in the silence after." Outside, the bells of St. Mirawold's began to chime again. Their rhythm was slightly off, but it no longer mattered. The truth had been struck, if not perfectly, then clearly enough. A pew creaked under Wimsey's weight as he lowered himself beside the great stone font, watching Inspector Waring shepherd the stricken household back toward the vicarage. Sunlight slanted through the clerestory, gilding motes of dust that danced like exhausted cherubs over the silent keys of the organ. Mrs. Penrose's muffled sobs drifted faintly across the graveyard grass, then fell away behind the closing door, replaced by the low murmur of Waring's official voice. Only Bunter lingered, tidying the score on its rack with reverent fingers. "Well?" Whimsy asked, almost idly. Bunter's gloved hand paused a fraction. "A remarkable performance, my lord, but if I may—" "Do," Whimsy said. "There is one bar Mrs. Penrose could never play." Bunter struck a single note, an uncompromising low C that rumbled the floorboards. "Eleanor Carter weighed 9 stone at least, sir. Even with advantage of desperation, Mrs. Penrose could not have carried her alone. Dragged, perhaps. But there were no furrows in the turf, and the hem of the victim's cloak was clean. Someone set her down as though she merely sat and dozed. Forgive me. But the vicar's wife is neither strong nor practiced in such charades." "Quite," said Whimsy. "Nor would she know how to twist a cervical joint so surgically. An ugly job, but neat, precise violence, done by someone accustomed to the leverage of shoulders. A manservant, perhaps, or a man of tools." Whimsy's gaze drifted to a row of hymn numbers left ready for Sunday. A gardener shapes limbs with pruning shears, after all, or an antiquarian who lifts crates of folios. Yet Mrs. Penrose is pivotal. The set dresser, if you like, not the tragedian. He rose and paced the aisle. "The question is, why would she shield the true killer?" Pritchard hears a male voice, yet swears only now that it belongs to one he knows. Guilt can silence a butler, but loyalty guides his silence. Whimsy halted beside the pulpit and laid his palm upon the olive-green brocade. "Bunter, ring the vestry bell once, would you? And listen carefully for echoes." Bunter obliged. The bell gave a small, nervous tink. Somewhere beyond the wall, a dog barked once, then fell still. When the peal faded, Whimsy turned. "That throat of iron carries farther than one imagines. Imagine a signal at 10:30, the hour Eleanor chose to slip from supper. A bell, a lamp in the shed, a calculated interval while household clocks disagree. She opens the garden sash, believing in romance or repentance. And then," Whimsy demonstrated, seizing the air, twisting with angular certainty. "One practiced jerk, sideways and down. No amateurs flailing. That is discipline, Bunter. A man trained to silence animals, or, I'm afraid, to reshelve heavy tomes without tearing their fragile spines. Mr. Garraway, then. He has strength, yes, and anger, but he lacks serenity. There was no bruising about the shoulders, no struggle. Our killer was calm. Consider Reverend Penrose's sermon last Whitsunday. The world belongs to those who can hold a quiet conscience. A motto a butler might admire and obey." Bunter's brows lifted. "Pritchard?" "Imagine it," Whimsy said. "An aging retainer, grateful for the Penroses' kindness, terrified the village scandal will ruin them. If Eleanor threatened revelation, an affair, a hidden child, who knows? He would do anything to protect the vicar's wife. He opens the boots, dons them, size large enough for his feet, leaves the house by service stairs. Waits in the shed, coaxed by her plea. When Eleanor appears, he ends the matter swiftly. Then together they stage the body. He hoists her on one shoulder. Mrs. Penrose smooths the cloak. The glove he places on the bench, a romantic detail meant to redirect suspicion toward Garraway. Bunter considered. But why twist the neck rather than poison or suffocation? Speed and certainty, my man. No screaming, no marks a lady could not bear to see. And Pritchard has strength to spare. Note the coal scuttles he hoists each dawn with scarcely a grunt. Yet guilt gnaws. He overhears my theory, sees salvation in confession, but cannot betray his mistress outright. So he produces the slip of manuscript to nudge us nearer. Then our play has another act, Bunter said. Indeed, one cannot prosecute on inference alone. We must coax the butler to speak the show's last line. Outside the church, Whimsy joined Waring, who was pacing the yew avenue with restless impatience. He laid out the new alignment of facts, the impossibility of Mrs. Penrose's lone strength, the boot size, the butler's belated testimony. Waring listened, jaw clenched. "I dislike conjecture, Lord Peter." "And I abhor half-truths," Whimsy answered. "Permit me 2 hours. At luncheon I shall stage a little experiment. Should it fail, arrest whom you please, and I shall pen the apology." Reluctantly, Waring agreed. At noon, the west parlour filled again, less ceremonious now, chairs arranged in a restless semicircle. Pritchard entered bearing a tea-tray, placed it precisely, and retreated to his habitual shadow. Whimsy took centre carpet with a small metronome and a roll of twine. "I've been asked," he began lightly, "how a song might travel from church to garden, across stone, glass, and hedge. Allow me to demonstrate." He handed the twine's end to Ede, requested the curate stand by the French windows. The other end he passed to Garraway, positioned near the fireplace. The vicar and Mrs. Penrose sat together, silently observing. Finally, Whimsy beckoned Pritchard. "Take this midpoint, good fellow, and stand upon the rug. Excellent! Now imagine these threads are lines of sound, tensioned between musician and audience. If one plucks—" He snapped the twine near Ede. A faint vibration travelled to Pritchard's fingers. "So a note rings, but should the midpoint drop—" He lowered Pritchard's hand. The twine sagged, slackening to the floor. "The vibration fails. The audience hears silence. Miss Carter sought to restore tension. Someone severed it." Whimsy fixed Pritchard with a mild gaze. "You alone occupy that pivot, my dear fellow. Servant of house and church alike. You heard both notes, struck the chord of protection, and in fear for your mistress, muted it." Colour drained from the butler's face. He opened his mouth, closed it, then managed. "My lord, I don't—" "You do," Whimsy said, gentle but inexorable. "Mrs. Penrose planned distraction, but lacked the nerve. You supplied it. You waited in the shed, the strongest point between house and vestry. When Eleanor crossed the garden, you stepped out. It was quick, perhaps even merciful. Then you carried her." A gardener's path behind the yews kept dew from the cloak. The body seated, head arranged, glove placed, candle, gravel. All neat, but sound. Pritchard, sound betrays us. The slammed latch, the whispered prayer you spoke when lifting her. Heard by Miss Carter's own metronome, then recorded by the scatter of wax upon the sill. The butler's eyes filled. "Milady begged me," he whispered. "She said Eleanor would ruin everything. Her husband, the parish, my place. Said we must frighten her. I never meant—" "Frightening is perilous labour," Whimsy murmured, "particularly for a man whose hands know leverage." Mrs. Penrose rose, tears renewed. "It was my doing," she cried. "I asked only that he bring her back, persuade her." Whimsy shook his head. "Words said in fear, wielded by hands, bred to obedience. You rehearsed a moral lesson. It became tragedy. Now you must face the consequence. Both of you." Waring stepped forward, cuffs ready but expression reluctant. Before he could speak, Reverend Penrose stood, frail dignity in every line. "I shall speak first," the vicar said softly, I did not know the depth of my wife's dread, nor the burden upon Pritchard. The sin is mine also, for blindness, for pride." He turned to his butler. "Old friend, lay down your burden. We must bear it together, come what may." Pritchard's shoulders sagged, the granite facade crumbled. "I am ready," he said to Waring. The inspector read him the charge, voice formal, yet his eyes followed the vicar, as though measuring the shattering of a life's vocation. Mrs. Penrose grasped Whimsy's sleeve. "Does God forgive a coward's lie?" she whispered. "He forgives truth spoken at last," he returned. "Courage is often late to the party, but it still brings a gift." As Waring led Pritchard from the room, Garraway exhaled a tremulous breath. "She died for music," he muttered, "and village virtue killed her." "No," Whimsy said, gathering his hat. "She died for love's disguise. Virtue played only the understudy." Outside, the bells tolled the quarter, all 8 strokes in flawless order, Bunter having adjusted their ancient mechanism before breakfast. For the first time in years, the chime rang true, bright as glass in the keen air. Whimsy paused beneath the yew, listening. At length he smiled, a brief, bitter-sweet curve. "Eleanor would have liked that accuracy," he said. Bunter tilted his head. "A pity she cannot hear it, my lord." "She hears," Whimsy replied. "Perfection resounds beyond our muddled bar lines." They turned toward the gravel path, where footprints overlapped, fresh authority over older sin. Behind them, the west-facing window glittered blindly in the sun, reflecting only the garden it had so long ignored. Rain returned to St. Myrowald's in the small hours, a soft, unhurried drizzle whose hiss on the yew needles lingered long after the clouds had gone. Lord Peter Whimsy, lodged now at the humble Crown and Pelican, woke to that faint percussion and the gentler rattle of milk cans in the yard below. He lay a moment, considering the day's agenda. Inspector Waring to deliver Pritchard to Tillingsborough, Mrs. Penrose to be interviewed under caution, the curate's statement to be copied into the record, and felt, oddly, the itch of unfinished calculation. Numbers, when missummed, tugged at him like burrs, a minus sign where a plus belonged, a remainder left unaccounted, and something here refused to balance. Bunter appeared with shaving water and the Times. "Rumour already, my lord," he said, tapping the headline. "Butler held in vicarage tragedy." Whimsy scanned the column, a tidy narrative of jealousy, improvised violence, remorseful confession. Tidy and wrong, for life preferred loose threads. An hour later he walked the lane toward the church, raincoat flapping like a disgruntled rook. He carried in his pocket 2 objects, the honeysuckle twig recovered by the sundial, and a brass key to the vestry, discreetly retained after yesterday's drama. The churchyard was empty save for a robin hunting worms in the damp grass. Whimsy tiptoed past the choir door, fitted the key, and slipped inside. Morning light pooled through the nave windows, thin and pewter-coloured. He crossed to the organ, lifted the music rack, and ran a finger along its back edge. Dust, yes, but beneath, a faint line of residue. Sticky where polish met old varnish, he sniffed. Lavender beeswax, used by Pritchard on household woodwork. No honeysuckle here. He recalled Mrs. Goddard's confession. Her pew polish, coloured with honeysuckle oil pressed from vines behind the shop, left a distinctive fragrance. Church pews, then, not vicarage furniture. Yet the gravel in Eleanor's hand had smelled of honeysuckle beeswax, not lavender. If Pritchard provided candles and wax, why the wrong scent? He rose, crossed to the front pew, and knelt. The seat-back gleamed, freshly buffed, exhaling the same sweet perfume as the twig in his pocket. He pressed his thumb to the grain. It came away faintly tacky. Someone had polished just here, over-polished, perhaps, to mask scuffs or to harvest wax for later use. A caretaker's task, or a curate's. A whisper behind him startled a grunt. "Lord Peter!" Reverend Ede stepped from the side aisle, eyes red-rimmed, his surplice weighted with damp. "Apologies," Whimsy said lightly. "Research before breakfast." Ede managed a wan smile. "I came to pray for guidance. Yesterday was unspeakable." Unspeakable things always beg to be spoken, don't they? Whimsy brushed dust from his knees. "Tell me, Ambrose, did you polish this pew?" The curate blinked. "Yes, Saturday evening. I had a youth group, but they never came. I dislike wasted time." "With Mrs. Goddard's honeysuckle wax?" "It's all she supplies us. The vicar prefers the scent to lavender." Whimsy filed that. "Did you see anyone else here?" "No." Ede hesitated. "Only Eleanor, practicing." "And did she meet you elsewhere later?" Ede's hands tightened on his Bible. "I told the inspector everything. I retired after writing the note." "But the note was delivered unsigned," Whimsy reminded him. "The postmistress believed you sent it. You never confirmed." I thought it kinder not to involve myself further." "Kindness is a curious word," Whimsy said. "Consider, your note admonished her to sing without shame, yet your handwriting urged modulate to silence. A contradiction, surely." Colour drained from Ede's cheeks. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, like an organ pipe robbed of wind. Whimsy let silence deepen, watching guilt swell in the curate's throat. At last Ede whispered, "I wanted her to be careful. People misconstrue passion." "Indeed they do." Whimsy pocketed the twig. "We misconstrue ourselves, sometimes, until truth presses like a key upon a chamber organ. Make no mistake, Reverend, the wrong man sits in a cell." He left Ede trembling among the pews and strode into the rain, coat collar up. Loose thread number 1, the wax. Loose thread number 2, the weight of a 9-stone woman lifted with ease. Pritchard had the strength, but so did Ede, who rowed the village rowing skiff each dawn on the mill pond. Bunter had observed as much through the inn window. And Ede, unlike Pritchard, had cause to fear scandal of a particularly clerical nature. Whispered infatuation with a soprano half his age, the very gossip Eleanor threatened to broadcast in song. An hour later, Whimsy intercepted Inspector Waring outside the police motor. Rain beaded on the inspector's mackintosh. Pritchard, handcuffed in the back, stared ahead like a man awaiting judgment he believed deserved. "Before you depart," Whimsy said quietly, "grant me 5 minutes free of protocol." Waring scowled, but nodded. Whimsy leaned into the car. "Pritchard, you told me you heard a male voice the night Eleanor died. You believed it was someone you knew. Was it the vicar?" Pritchard's brow knit. "No, my lord." "Was it Garraway?" The butler shook his head, puzzled. "Was it me?" "No." "Then it was the curate." A pause, barely a pulse. But in that pause, truth glittered. Pritchard's eyes wavered. Whimsy smiled sadly. "You tried to shield Mrs. Penrose. Good man that you are. But shielding Reverend Ede as well." He shook his head. "Too heavy a burden, even for your broad shoulders." Pritchard swallowed. "He begged me, said Miss Carter meant to ruin the vicar, destroy the parish. I placed myself between harm and household." "And how did that service end, Pritchard?" His eyes closed. Waring exhaled. "You're asking me to swap suspects on a maybe and a honeysuckle candle." "I'm telling you the melody's wrong," Whimsy answered. "Pritchard, did you carry the body?" "No," the butler murmured. "I helped arrange it, yes, but he carried her, like a child." "Thank you," Whimsy said. He straightened, nodded to Waring. "Inspector, we must arrest Reverend Ede for murder, Mrs. Penrose for conspiracy after the fact, and release this man. Do you wish fuller argument? I have a row of pew numbers that sing the tale." Waring hesitated, jaw working. Then he signalled the constable. "Remove the cuffs," he said gruffly, "and bring the curate to the station." With Pritchard freed, Whimsy walked him to the vicarage steps, the rain easing as though the sky, too, had made confession. Mrs. Penrose awaited in the hallway, veil clasped hastily over tear-stained cheeks. The butler bowed. "I am sorry, madam." She touched his arm. "Your loyalty was too dear, Pritchard. Forgive me." "Always." "Madam!" Whimsy left them, stepping into the drawing-room, where Reverend Penrose stood staring at a blank notepaper on his desk. "It seems," the vicar said hoarsely, "I am to lose a curate and perhaps a wife to magistrates' courts. What sermon comforts that?" "One on false witness and honest atonement," Whimsy suggested, removing his hat. "Speak it gently." Penrose managed a wan nod. "Lord Peter, will the village ever forgive?" "Villages have long memories, vicar, but deeper need of peace. Truth, once told, lies quiet." He walked back through the hall as Garraway appeared, led by a constable for formal clearance of his name. The bookseller halted. "I only ever loved her music," he said. "Did she know?" "She did," Whimsy answered. "She left the score open on your favourite motif. Keep it, and sing now and then. It honours her." Outside, Bunter awaited with the touring car. Rain had ceased. Skylarks cut bright arcs over distant stubble. Whimsy settled in the passenger seat, gloves in lap. "A difficult aria, my lord," Bunter said, starting the engine. "But the coda resolves," Whimsy replied. "Pritchard was the pedal note, deep, sustaining, unfaltering. Ede supplied the treble of rash virtue, and Mrs. Penrose the mournful alto, too afraid to sing a true note. And Miss Carter? A soaring soprano silenced by other voices, yet she shapes the final harmony." Whimsy leaned back, watching St. Merewold's recede. "Some scores demand dissonance before they resolve, Bunter. We simply followed the key changes." The car turned toward the London road. Behind them, the west-facing window of the vicarage caught a last shard of weak sunlight, flashed like a signal, and then fell dark. Inspector Waring's constable found Reverend Ede in the vestry, kneeling not in prayer, but in frantic industry. His hands were raw where he had been scrubbing at the sill with lye and a stiff brush, trying to erase the scratches Whimsy had pointed out the day before. Waring watched in silence, then laid a hand on the curate's shoulder. Ede started, saw the handcuffs, and sagged as if his bones had been drawn out through his feet. There was little resistance, only a repeated whisper. "She would have ruined us," that clung to the damp stone like mould. Yet Whimsy felt the solution too abrupt, too bloodless. A note struck but not held long enough to vibrate every corner of the nave. He requested, and received, permission for one final interview. So late that afternoon, the curate was brought under guard to the church. The light outside had turned the colour of pewter. Inside, candles stood ready upon the end of each row, their flames steady in the still air. Whimsy sat at the organ, fingers resting on the silent keys, while Ede was placed upon the front pew. Bunter lurked by the choir stalls, and Waring stood near the door with the watchful posture of a man prepared for any incongruity, spiritual or otherwise. Wimsey spoke without lifting his gaze from the keyboard. "Curate, the organ has 28 stops. You know each by heart. Tell me, what happens if I pull this one?" He drew the dulciana. A soft sigh of pipes responded. No melody yet, merely breath. Ede's eyes flicked toward the pipes, then back to his captors. "It colors the quiet passages," he murmured. "Exactly. Soft but distinct, filling what would otherwise remain silence." Wimsey's fingers pressed a single chord, the C-G-E flat of Eleanor's rebellious motif. It hovered, tender as regret. "When you marked modulate to silence in her score, you did not mean restraint. You meant erasure. Silence as a grave." He added the D-sharp, dissonant, unresolved, then lifted his hands so the sound hung incomplete. Ede's shoulders twitched. "She taunted me," he said hoarsely. "With her phrases, her clever subtext. I was her confessor, yet she flaunted temptation in every bar. She would not repent." "She threatened to expose you," Wimsey corrected gently. "In the vestry, she confronted you with the truth, that your nightly rounds to the girls' Bible study were less pastoral than possessive, and that she would sing it plain in London if the vicar refused to listen. You planned a lesson, perhaps merely a scare, but fear is a clumsy tutor." Ede's mouth worked. "I followed her only to plead. She called me a coward, said the village would see me for what I was. She turned to leave, mocked me. He clasped his hands, knuckles whitening. There was a candlestick lying on the prie-dieu, heavy brass. I struck without thought once. The rest required orchestration, Wimsey supplied. He rose and stepped down from the dais, the music still vibrating in the timbers. You were clever enough to know brute force left clues. So you ran for Pritchard, told him Eleanor had slipped, that scandal loomed. He loved the Penroses, he agreed to help. Together you devised the tableau. The glove a lover might drop, the candles to invoke midnight piety, the boots to mislead. Mrs. Penrose, half hysterical, polished the pew where blood had spattered and fetched honeysuckle wax to mask iron's scent. Ede looked up, his eyes raw with something between defiance and despair. She believed I only meant to save the vicar's reputation. She never asked what I had done before I fetched her. She loves her husband, Lord Peter. She feared only disgrace. Disgrace, like murder, is rarely solitary, Wimsey said. You three formed a chord, her fear, Pritchard's duty, your zeal. But the harmony was false, and dissonance, as Miss Carter showed, demands resolution. He reached into his pocket, withdrew the twig of honeysuckle, and laid it on the pew rail in front of the curate. Your wax left this perfume across the body and the bench. A small error, but music is built on small intervals. Without it you might have escaped even my ear. Ede's gaze fell. It is finished, then. Almost. Wimsey signalled Bunter, who dimmed all but 2 candles. The church sank into an amber gloom. From the deepening hush, Wimsey spoke again, his voice low enough that each syllable seemed to roll along the nave like a pebble across still water. Tell me what you whispered when you struck her. Pritchard heard it, but could not make sense. A single word in Latin, he thought. The curate's lips parted, shut, then began to move. Tace. A single syllable, soft as a dove coo. I said, be silent. So you did, Wimsey murmured, and she is, yet you will speak now. He turned to Waring. Inspector, You have your confession. I ask only that you remember Mrs. Penrose's part was one of fear, not malice, and Pritchard acted under false belief. Your magistrates will decide what mercy to temper with justice." Waring inclined his head. "The law believes in gradations, my lord, and juries hear music in ordinary speech." Ada rose without protest as the constable clasped the cuffs. He seemed, if anything, relieved, like a man whose shoulders forgot their burden only when the weight was replaced by irons. Wimsey watched until the door shut behind the party, candles winking in the draught, then returned to the organ. He pulled out the Vox Angelica stop and let a single A minor chord float upward, resolving at last to C major as faint daylight bled through the stained glass. Bunter approached. "A bleak business, my lord." "Bleak indeed," Wimsey said, "but even tragedy fulfills its own logic. Eleanor ended on her discord. I have given her the cadence denied." They left the church and walked the lane to the vicarage, where Reverend Penrose waited on the doorstep, face grey but composed. Wimsey explained the confession in the simplest terms. The vicar closed his eyes, murmured a psalm, half under breath, then surprised Wimsey by asking to see Pritchard at once. When the butler came, Penrose took his hand. "You have served us all your life. I will serve you now, before any bench." Pritchard tried to speak, but succeeded only in pressing the vicar's fingers against his brow, as though that benediction might steady worlds. Mrs. Penrose, veiled in black, stood at the parlour door. She listened to the news without collapse. "Then I, too, must find a truth to tell," she said. "I shall say I feared gossip more than sin, and thus bred both. That will do for the papers." Wimsey bowed. "There is courage, madam, in putting the correct label on an old bottle. Vintage scandal often sours quietly." Evening came. Wimsey and Bunter dined alone at the Crown and Pelican, cold pheasant, new carrots, and a bottle of claret chosen for its mildness. The inn's tap-room buzzed with speculation, but none dared intrude on their corner, where a small fire answered rains, soft tapping on the leaded panes. Wimsey toyed with his glass. "Odd thing, Bunter," he said. "I do not detest Ede. He is less villain than coward, clutching piety like armour. Yet he killed a girl for the unforgivable crime of honesty." "Cowards, my lord, often spill more blood than brutes. They swing the first blow to stop the mirror speaking." "True, and yet I pity him, just as I pity Mrs. Penrose, though pity never resurrects. One can only atone by living the next bar correctly." He sipped. "Tomorrow we shall return to London. There is a concert at Queen's Hall. I find I need to hear Mozart played without the threat of candles and Latin vowels." Bunter poured the last of the claret. "Music untouched by murder, sir. That will be a novelty." Wimsey's smile held both weariness and warmth. "Novelty, Bunter, is merely truth in a fresh waistcoat. Let us hope we do not spill wine on it before the final movement." Rain eased, leaving only the faintest patter on cobbles. Beyond the window, St. Meerewald's tower stood sharp against the lamplit mist, its bells silent, but in imagination perfectly in tune. Wimsey looked out at that quiet silhouette, raised his glass in a wordless toast to music, to flawed humanity, and to silence finally honest. Dawn broke over St. Meerewald's with the hesitancy of someone peering into a recently tidied room, unsure whether the disorder had truly been vanquished. A thin gauze of mist clung to the lanes, smothering the village's habit of eavesdropping on its own echoes. Wimsey, suitcase in hand, paused outside the Crown and Pelican to let the air settle in his lungs. It carried none of the honeysuckle scent that had haunted the previous days, only the clean, faint aroma of damp earth and a hint of coal smoke from early fires. The world, it seemed, had resolved to an unobtrusive key after its violent modulation. Bunter arrived with the motor just as the church bell tolled 6. Its notes, corrected by his diligence, rang true now, C major, as exact as a physicist's constant. Whimsy smiled. Well struck. No longer a murderer's metronome, but a parish's chronometer. Every village deserves proper tempo, my lord, Bunter replied, stowing the luggage. Shall we collect the inspector? They found Waring outside the police house, coat collar up, lighting a pipe that refused the match's flame. He waved them on with a brusque but not unfriendly gesture. Tillingsborough's magistrate would take statements at 10, and he still had a sermon's worth of paperwork to redact into affidavit prose. Whimsy, leaning from the car, offered one last observation. Remember, Inspector, confession is a treble, corroboration, the bass. Let the jury hear both. Waring grunted assent, then, as the motor disappeared round the bend, raised the sullen pipe in reluctant salute. The road to Cranley Station wound between hedgerows jewelled with rain. At one gate, Pananturt's solitary figure watched them pass. Garraway, coat buttoned high, a leather folio hugged to his chest. He nodded gravely, and Whimsy tipped his hat. The bookseller would testify, of course, but his grief would find quieter expression on ruled manuscript pages, perhaps an edition of Spenser, annotated in sorrow. Whimsy resolved to secure a copy when it appeared. Marginalia born of heartbreak can prove unexpectedly illuminating. The platform at Cranley smelled of wet cinders and overboiled tea. Whimsy purchased 2 first-class tickets to London and accepted the station master's apology for the delay. A freight wagon had shed its coupling near Guildford, holding up the down express. Perfection is momentary, Whimsy observed to Bunter. Even well-tuned clocks hiccup. They boarded a compartment already warmed by a small coal stove, its window hazed with breathy curls. As the whistle shrieked, the village receded like a reluctant memory, leaving only the west window glancing pale sunlight through the mist. A last glimpse of the wrong garden, now facing nobody in particular. Once the train found its rhythm, Whimsy opened the Times to the legal docket. Columns of petty larcenies and trade disputes scrolled past, but one item caught his eye. Chancery schedules, estate of the late Sir Julian Freak, petitions for revision of disbursement to the St. Luke's Endowment for Early Music, he chuckled. Even the dead quarrel over harmony, Bunter. A persistent theme, my lord, Bunter agreed, unfolding his notebook. If I may, expense account. Later. Whimsy leaned back. Let us audit something more fragile. Did you see Mrs. Penrose's eyes when the curate confessed? Not anger, relief. The truth, however dire, rescues the righteous from the exhaustion of pretense. And Pritchard, my lord? He returns as caretaker once sentence is pronounced? Quite possibly. The diocese will show mercy, but penitence is seldom comfortable. He must live with the knowledge that his loyalty became complicity. Whimsy drummed fingers on the windowsill. It is a hazard of virtues, Bunter. Stretched too far, they may snap and slice like razored wire. The train lunged through a tunnel, plunging the compartment into velvet dark. When light returned, Whimsy's reflection in the glass appeared momentarily older, eyes shadowed by the overnight tussle with fatal music. He opened his cigarette case, hesitated, and shut it again. "I should ask Parker to dine," he muttered. "He'll enjoy the academic tangle. Eads theology, in conflict with his desires. A poor showing for Eton, but a splendid footnote for criminology." Bunter inclined his head. "And the evening concert." "I crave unsullied harmony," Whimsy said. "Mozart, perhaps Brahms. Something where mathematics of sound remains obedient. No dissonant priests, no clandestine pew polish." King's Cross welcomed them with the clang of buffers and the bark of porters. London air, part coal, part optimism, filled Whimsy's lungs like tonic. A cab delivered them to 110A Piccadilly, where the oak door opened upon shelves of books that had patiently awaited his narrative. Bunter vanished to unpack. Whimsy stood a while in the drawing-room, hand resting on the grand piano's fallboard. He struck a ninth, daring but clean, then resolved it with a smile. "No more Gothic intervals," he told the instrument. After luncheon, he dictated a précis of the case to an amused Parker, who promised to forward it to the Yards Training College under the title The Honeysuckle Wax Fallacy. Reports dispatched, Whimsy changed for the concert. White tie, starch so crisp it might slice a scandal in half. Bunter, immaculate in evening blacks, accompanied him to Queen's Hall, where a capacity crowd buzzed with anticipation. The Mira Hess recital, all Mozart. They found their seats minutes before the house lights dimmed. The opening of the rondo in D major rolled out, buoyant as spring water. Whimsy closed his eyes, letting the phrases wash through the recent cacophonies. Yet midway the motif wavered. The pianist lingered on a dominant seventh that promised complications, but resolved, with effortless grace, back to the tonic. Whimsy breathed out, tension unspooling like thread from a shuttle. During the interval, he strolled the crush bar, cognac in hand. A dowager countess asked whether he still collected inconabula. A junior minister inquired, sotto voce, if rumors of a political resignation at St. Merovold's were exaggerated. Whimsy gave each an answer as light as froth, and drifted to a tall window where city lamps glittered over wet stones. Bunter joined him, bearing a program. "There is an encore promised," the valet announced. "Schubert's Impromptu in G-flat." "Appropriate," Whimsy said. Schubert understood sorrow that smiles through the bars. He sipped the last of the cognac. "Curious, Bunter. Music endures beyond its performers, while murder ends both performance and performer. A killer seeks silence. Melody survives." "Then Miss Carter is not wholly lost," Bunter observed. "No." Whimsy tapped the program. "Somewhere tonight, a choir mistress rehearses her score. Unaware, a dangerous cadence nearly choked its composer. She will smooth it, soften the dissonance, and the congregation will call it beautiful, without knowing why." Back in their seats, the final movement of the sonata in A shimmered under Hess's fingers. No ghost of honeysuckle, no echo of Latin command. Only disciplined joy, and the sense, rare in modern life, that every note stood precisely where it ought. When the last chord fell, applause rose like surf. Whimsy waited until the third curtain call before taking up his cloak. In the vestibule he paused beside Bunter. "Tell me," he said, brow arching with familiar mischief, "have we still some of that Penrose Parish honey, Mrs. Parker, sent at Christmas?" Bunter's eyes glinted. "2 jars, my lord." "Splendid. We shall serve it at breakfast tomorrow. Best to remind ourselves that bees, at least, know how to ornament the unsullied without recourse to homicide." They stepped into the London night. The sky, freshly washed by late rain, showed a single star trembling above rooftops like the quietest note of a well-tuned organ. Whimsy touched the brim of his hat to it, a private salute, then turned down Piccadilly, with his stride set to the comfortable tempo of a man whose internal metronome, for the moment, agreed entirely with the universe. The days following the trial passed in a kind of muted aftermath, as St. Merewold settled back into its usual rhythms, though the shadow of tragedy lingered in corners where sunlight once played unchecked. Whimsy found himself once more in the vicarage drawing-room, the air heavy with unsaid words and the soft ticking of an ancient clock. The case had closed, the confession accepted, and yet something niggled at his mind, an unresolved chord in the otherwise neat progression of events. He sat by the window, watching the last autumn leaves spiral like hesitant notes in a fading symphony. Bunter approached quietly, a letter in hand. "My lord," he said, "this arrived this morning. Postmarked London. No return address." Whimsy took the envelope, fingers deft. The handwriting was unfamiliar, elegant, precise, and intentionally cryptic. Inside, a single line. "The final measure awaits where silence is most profound." He smiled faintly. A challenge, then. Someone seeks an encore. The clue, subtle as a piano's soft pedal, directed Whimsy back to the church, specifically to the crypt beneath St. Merewold's nave, a place long neglected except for the occasional flicker of candlelight during vigils. The silence most profound could only mean there, where secrets sleep beneath stone. That evening, accompanied by Waring and Bunter, Whimsy descended into the cool stillness below. The air was thick with the scent of earth and forgotten prayers. Illuminated by lanterns, the crypt's shadows stretched like waiting hands. Whimsy's gaze swept the walls and floor, noting faint scuff marks near a loose flagstone, an irregularity overlooked before. With careful effort, he pried it loose, revealing a narrow cavity containing a small, leather-bound book and a folded piece of parchment. Unfolding the note, Whimsy read aloud. "Eleanor was no mere victim of zealotry, but a composer whose final work was stolen and silenced. The true culprit is not the hand that struck her, but the one who sought to bury her legacy. Listen not to the confession, but to the silence between." His eyes narrowed. The book was a score, unsigned, but unmistakably in Eleanor's hand, her handwriting, matching annotations found in her personal effects. The missing pages of her magnum opus lay here, hidden. The truth crystallized. Reverend Ede's act was murder, yes, but not the entire crime. Someone else had conspired to suppress Eleanor's music, fearing its message more than the scandal of death. Mrs. Penrose's fear of gossip, Pritchard's loyalty, even Ede's violence had obscured a deeper motive, an attempt to erase Eleanor's voice forever. The final reveal came swiftly thereafter. Cross-examination of Pritchard, prompted by this discovery, unraveled his silent guilt. He had destroyed portions of Eleanor's work at the vicarage, hoping to protect reputations, but instead perpetuating injustice. In the end, justice did not merely punish, it restored. Eleanor's recovered compositions were published posthumously, her name honored in concert halls rather than whispered in shadowed pews. As Whimsy closed the book, the organ's pipes seemed to sigh with release, a long-awaited cadence now fulfilled. The detective allowed himself a rare smile. Justice like music, demanded both hearing and silence, confession and subtlety. The case, finally resolved, faded into the quiet harmony of a world righted, where even silence held its proper place.